Welcome to our event titled What's Happening in Turkey? Gezi Protests and the Future. My name is Arif Şimşek and I will be the moderator of the event tonight. And I am Assistant Professor of Economics at MIT's Economics Department. But I'm here in my capacity as a member of Boston Bull, which is the organization that brings you this event this evening. So let me start by telling you a little bit about Boston Bull, what it is and what we do. So this is a group that organically came together last summer during the protests that started in Taksim Gezi Park. And this is a very diverse set of people. There are students, academics, artists, young professionals, older professionals. And what brought this diverse set of people together is a common concern for the human rights violations in Turkey. We wanted to show solidarity with the protesters, and we wanted to condemn especially the police brutality by which those protests were suppressed. And as many of you know, Turkish police used excessive amounts of tear gas, water cannon, along with other brutal tactics. According to one report by the Turkish Medical Association, by July 10, which is roughly 40 days after the protest started, more than 8,000 people reported injuries to hospitals in incidents related to clashes with the police. 61 of them were severely injured, and 11 people unfortunately had severe eye injuries because of close-range tear gas canister shots and rubber bullet shots by the police. And unfortunately, 5 people, including a police officer, died, and the death toll has risen even further since then. And what made matters even worse is that the Turkish media, throughout these events, especially at these earlier stages, kept a blind eye, even when the international media found the events important enough to cover. Actually, I saw yesterday a cartoon which showed that penguins in Antarctica were watching the protests in Turkey, where the audiences in Turkey were watching penguin documentaries. I think that pretty much sums up the reaction of the mainstream Turkish media at the initial stages. So these tragedies and the adverse developments brought our group together, but then we stayed together, and our group morphed into a broader movement that promotes human rights along with other principles of pluralistic democracy in Turkey. So we do events, informational events like briefings, speeches, panels like this one, but we also do weekly discussion forums where we discuss among ourselves issues related to democracy, pluralistic democracy and human rights in Turkey. And those discussions, in fact, have been quite fruitful and quite an educational experience for many of us involved. And they are held very democratically, and they are in particular open to public. So if you would like to participate in our forums, or if you'd like to be informed about our future events, you're very welcome to do so. You just need to provide your information in the information sheet outside. Now, I hope as that description, I hope, makes clear, this evening's event fits very well with the purposes and the spirit of Boston Bull. We have an excellent set of speakers who will tell us about their views of the Gezi protest. And we're going to frame this discussion as follows. So there were, of course, many dimensions to the Gezi protest. But one thing we think this protest made clear is that a significant part of the population in Turkey is unhappy with either the government or the state of Turkey. I mean, the protesters naturally included followers of many of the opposition parties, but they actually represented a much broader spectrum than that. Which suggests that the discontent associated with the protest was in fact quite widespread. So one thing that we'll try to do this evening is to try to understand the sources of this discontent and the resulting tension by analyzing it from different angles. So our first speaker will be Professor Aslı Ilsız, who's sitting at that end of the table. And Professor Ilsız is Assistant Professor of Middle Eastern and Islamic Studies at New York University, and her recent research is about quote-unquote plurality in post-1980 military coup period of. She studies. You see, even the mixer doesn't want to talk about the military coup of Turkey. She studies the military coup period. Of course, that's a period that featured a bit of authoritarianism. And so authoritarianism is not something new in Turkish history, but it seems to have reappeared recently. And Professor Ilsız will tell us about this recent growth in authoritarianism, as well as the growth in neoliberalism, so focusing on the concentration of political as well as economic power and the discontent that this might have generated. And our second speaker will be Professor Zeynep Türkyılmaz, and she is Assistant Professor of History at Dartmouth University. College, sorry. And she, her recent research is about the Ottoman Empire, focusing on the struggles of religiously marginalized communities. And she's going to tell us tonight about something that might have similarities in Ottoman history. In particular, she's going to talk about neo-Ottoman tendencies in recent policy making in Turkey, with examples from both domestic and foreign policies, and which might have contributed to this content. And finally, we will have Professor Chomsky, Noam Chomsky, present his views of the protests and their significance. Professor Chomsky, of course, needs no introduction, but let me just say that he is Institute Professor and Professor of Linguistics Emeritus at MIT for many years, and he is a world-renowned scholar with fundamental contributions across various fields, especially cognitive and linguistic sciences. In fact, according to one study, he was the most cited living person between the years 1980 and 1992. He was surpassed only by people like William Shakespeare and Sigmund Freud. We are very happy that he's here with us tonight. But on top of all these academic accomplishments, he's also a very influential political commentator and activist. So I'm personally looking forward to his views on the Gezi events. And after Professor Chomsky, we will also have a 1 hour of question and answer part where we will get to hear from you. And there will be some rules about that part, which I'm going to describe later. But without further delay, please welcome Professor Ilsız to tell us about neoliberalism and authoritarianism in Turkey in the context of these events.
Can you hear me? Yeah. It is a great pleasure and an honor to participate in this panel with Noam Chomsky and Zeynep Türkyılmaz this evening, and I would like to thank the organizers for inviting me, and to my colleague Alp Şimşek for kindly moderating this panel. And I would like to thank you all for spending your Friday evening here. Overall, I think protests such as Gezi offer a valuable opportunity to consider how high security neoliberal nation-states operate in general, with Turkey as a particular instance. In the Turkish context, mobilization of law to absorb previously independent institutions has become a pattern of centralization of powers. Additionally, surveillance and anti-terror laws give the impression of a state of exception. This means a context in which law is mobilized and whereby the rights of citizens are suspended, and that the state officials appear to transcend law for the public good, and this is how it is justified in general in such systems. As such, law appears to be deployed to concentrate power and to promote neoliberal institutionalization, whereas those who are unhappy with these policies appear to be criminalized. This was exemplified also with Gezi protests, whereby the rise of authoritarianism was crystallized. I would like to emphasize here, however, what I mean by authoritarianism here is not to say that Turkey is a fully authoritarian regime. Clearly, of course, there is a competitive electoral system, a multi-party system. In spite of all of its problems with the 10% threshold in the electoral system, there is still a fair and competitive multi-party electoral system, relatively speaking. So rather what I mean by this is the rise of a lack of accountability, allegations of cronyism, policies that give the impression that the government operates in a state of exception. But again, when I mention this, I don't mean to say that this is a new phenomenon. Much of these things happened before in Turkey's history as well. So what is happening currently might not be an exception. But what appears to be new in this context is that there seems to be more neoliberal interests beyond such policies. And that this is actually conducted by a civilian government shown as a model of democracy in the Middle East. In this slide, there are three main areas that I would like to address briefly here. The first is the use of law to concentrate power for neoliberal institutionalization. Second, the use of law enforcement and the justice system that seem to come across as the criminalization of the dissidents. And third, surveillance and anti-terror laws. So the first segment where I would like to talk about the concentration of power and in the institutionalization process has been going on over the last few years especially. The government bureaucratized and centralized previously autonomous institutions. For example, in May 2011, the parliament, with its absolute AKP majority, granted the prime minister and his cabinet the right to issue decree laws for a period of 6 months. This gave the cabinet the right to pass laws without actually bringing them to the parliament for deliberation and vote. During this time period, various decrees hidden inside other decrees annulled various autonomous institutions or brought them under government control. Indeed, on 17 August 2011, a decree law annulled the independent commissions composed of scientists and others whose task was to protect national environmental sites. Instead, the decree gave the authority to decide whether a natural site is worthy of protection to the government's own Ministry of Environment and Urban Planning. It is important to note that the AKP's policy of absorbing autonomous institutions is not limited to the environment, but actually also extends to institutions like the stock markets or the National Academy of Sciences, which also were passed by decree laws. Regardless of how well these institutions actually functioned for the public good in the past, the major problem, so I don't mean to say that these were wonderful institutions that operated greatly before and now they're absorbed and everything is going down the hill, but rather what I'm saying is that the major problem here is the exercise of centralized control over different institutions by absorbing them rather than maybe reforming them or improving them. Whereas the right to pass decree laws has expired since then, various bills with similar motivation were brought to the AKP-dominant parliament. One such example is the controversial bill on the preservation of nature and biodiversity, which was on the AKP agenda actually for early June when just the Gezi protests had exploded. In yet another move towards over-centralization, it aimed at putting national parks and forests under the jurisdiction of the Ministry of Forestry and Waterworks. If passed, the bill would open up for discussion natural heritage status of over 12,000 currently protected national parks, natural heritage sites and forests, which may then be cleared for development, even the construction of nuclear and conventional power plants and factories. So the law decree I mentioned earlier targeted new designations of natural protection status, whereas this new bill was more targeting all currently protected sites and opening their protection status to negotiation. This controversial law now has been postponed, but not abandoned, probably in order not to provoke further protests for now. While it was unclear what would happen next in a controversial midnight bill after the Gezi protests, AKP deputies passed a law that absorbed the authority of the Chamber of Engineers and Architects into the Ministry of Environment and Urban Planning again. The Chamber had been instrumental in filing the initial court case to stop the demolition of Gezi Park. Reportedly, with this new bill, the Ministry of Environment and Urban Planning will be responsible for all the decisions related to the approval of urban projects, which were supervised by related chambers, such as the Chamber of Engineers and Architects. Therefore, it is not only scientists and natural conservancy, but also architects and urban planning that now appears to be rendered redundant by the government. Another core problem, so the second issue that I want to address in relation to the rise of authoritarianism and neoliberal institutionalization, is the apparent mobilization of the justice system to suppress and discourage dissent from such authoritarian and centralizing moves. Normally, a legal appeal against the policy regarding natural conservation could be launched again, through the courts. In fact, the Taksim platform, the protesters did just that, bringing a lawsuit against the privatization of Gezi Park. Given the circumstances, the court issued an expedited decision to halt the demolition of the park. And troublingly, it is now unclear what might happen next, as the AKP appealed to a higher court, which overruled the decision to halt the AKP plans and AK Party plans and opened a new case. And as I addressed earlier, the kinds of laws of protection that provided the basis of the first court decision appear to already be under the AK Party's radar. In fact, when AK Party officials first announced a possible referendum on Gezi, or a precedent, as they called it, they had to be reminded that there was actually an open court case on the matter, and only then they conceded that the referendum could be held after the court's decision. Another issue related to the justice system is a fact sheet that has been raised by a fact sheet issued by the Human Rights Association claims that over 5,000 people that were detained as part of the Gezi protests in July 2013. Increasing reports of investigations against students and teachers and professors, as well as Turkish state-sponsored Turkish radio and television workers who had supported or participated in the protests, are additionally alarming. Universities and high schools, for example, with their government-appointed administrators, appear to act as gatekeepers on behalf of the government, as they seem to seek to locate the dissidents and put them under surveillance or disciplinary action. Criminalization of the right to expression and assembly on the one hand, and passing laws to concentrate powers to further capitalist construction interests on the other, appear to operate together in neoliberal institutionalization. This has disturbing implications for the judicial process and contributes to the impression that the government operates in a prolonged state of exception. After the constitutional referendum in 2010, Turkey's already imperfect checks and balances appear to have been dismantled and further politicized. Consequently, following an invitation by the Turkish government, so the Turkish government actually invited Human Rights Council member, and there was a published report that was very critical on the independence of judges and lawyers in Turkey and the deployment of the anti-terror laws, especially after they were revised in 2006. So this brings me back to the third major problem that contributes to the rise of the authoritarian climate, the infamous anti-terror law. According to an Associated Press survey on the impact of the adoption of anti-terror laws after 9/11, which was initiated, of course, here and spread elsewhere, this survey was conducted in 66 countries. About 119,044 arrests and 35,177 convictions have occurred in these countries. More than half of these convictions came from China and Turkey. The chilling result, okay, so when we look at the numbers, China is number one in these arrests. But when we actually convert these numbers into the ratio and we look at the population, the chilling result is that Turkey was by far the most zealous enforcer of such legislation, convicting 12,897 people, or roughly 1 out of every 6,000 of its citizens, followed by China, which convicted 1 out of every 180,000 citizens. In 2005, before the changes to the anti-terror law, the total number convicted of terrorism in Turkey was only 273. As argued by Special Rapporteur Gabriela Noam in a report that I was mentioning earlier about United Nations Human Rights Council, All this raises questions regarding the expanded legal interpretations of what constitutes terror after 2006. And this is actually a global question, not just for Turkey. Under the anti-terror law, in the Turkish context, the special authorized courts have been over-empowered. At times translated as special heavy penal courts, these courts continued the legacy of former state security courts, mostly consolidated after the 1980s, also not a very good period. A recent report indicates that under AK Party, special authorized courts housed 68,000 investigations as compared to only 8,000 in 2001. Yet such courts have become the subject of major controversy because of allegations of mistrials or problematic use of evidence. There have been lots of controversies over inconclusive digital material, unreliable witnesses, inconsistent witness accounts, or objects like the kefiye, pushi, or books used as evidence of links to terrorist activity. In a recent, for example, report, the Initiative for Solidarity with Detained Students, Tutuklu Öğrencilerle Dayanışma İnisiyatifi, cites the case of a book authored by Jürgen Habermas, translated into Turkish as civil disobedience, being confiscated as evidence of illegal activity. Likewise, recent scandals over allegations that evidence was planted in major cases have made newspaper headlines, as lawyers and reporters have continued to raise similar questions regarding law enforcement and special authorized courts. In response to serious criticisms, including the concerns raised in the United Nations Special Rapporteur Gabriela Noam's report, in July 2012, the AK Party made new amendments, according to which special authorized courts would be abolished in name. But when you look closely at the changes, it appears that the special authorized powers are not, the courts are abolished, but there are new units where the special authorized powers would be transferred to. Even though there have been also recent amendments to the terror law, the ways in which it has been deployed during Gezi protests indicates that there are good reasons to continue to be concerned. So what are the broader implications of these? While the examples of the current rise of authoritarian state practices with lack of transparency and accountability can be multiplied, I would like to emphasize here that my goal is by no means to generate an exceptionalism for AK Party within the historical context of Turkey. Granted, this context has its own idiosyncrasies. But I also do not wish to claim that there is a Turkish exceptionalism in a broader international neoliberal system, whereby simultaneously different methods are deployed and also a rise of authoritarian democracies are being increasingly discussed by different groups. And this means actually, different scholars, sorry. And this means actually that, yes, there is multi-party competitive electoral system, but at the same time, surveillance is increasing. Anti-terror laws, how they are deployed, states of exception, these are all among the concerns that have been raised in recent works by different scholars. So I think that in this context, one of the most important things is to, while remaining critical of the current situation, not to also apply double standards. Indeed, I find it most distressing that international agencies, including the media, who had previously declared Turkey as a model of democracy in the Middle East, have now turned around and started to label Prime Minister Erdogan a dictator. Such statements treat the Turkish case as either cultural or exceptional in a manner that is Orientalist at best. Why does the Middle East need a model in the first place? Isn't this asking Turkey to assume a neo-Ottoman Big Brother role in the region? Something that my colleague Zeynep Türkmaz will actually elaborate on. Further, AK Party is not Turkey's first party with authoritarian tendencies, nor is it operating as a dictatorship. And I think even metaphorically, bringing up these terms, such as dictatorship, obscures more than it explains. And within the broader context, political and social, as I said, circumstances, especially after personification of systemic problems, such as attributing problems with the system in a locale without actually considering the international systems that actually feed into this local interpretations of neoliberal policies and authoritarianism. All right, or one that culturalizes protests, or authoritarianism. This regards the implicit connections between the legacy of the Cold War and the protests against neoliberal measures in places like Spain and Greece. And I really would like to propose that we look at those together. And I don't think that in the Turkish context, the rise of authoritarian tendencies cannot be easily explained with only one person's impetus. There's just one last thing I want to add here, or maybe not. All right. Basically, when I was actually looking into this, I was struck by how AK Party officials, including the Minister of Tourism and Culture, had mentioned that Gezi protests were hurting Turkey's image, and that basically, especially the international coverage was targeting somehow Turkey's brand name. And I was struck by brand name. What is that supposed to mean? And then I started looking more closely, and I started realizing that actually even President Abdullah Gül mentioned that basically that they worked so hard for 10 years to build the image of the country, but that these protests and the responses to the protests also have been hurting the image of the country, and that this would actually scare away foreign investors. Then I got curious and I opened AK Party's Political Science Academy textbook, where actually, the party officials are invited to take place, and the idea is for them to get some training whereby there would be a unified identity, institutional identity. And there I actually noticed that there were lengthy explanations about how there was an international system called branding countries, and it was Brand Finance that was actually an international company that was hierarchizing different countries, and actually they were seen and considered as ways of attracting foreign investors, and in the sense that if a country has stability, then it will be open to more foreign investments. And I was actually then wondering, could it be this one of the reasons why some of these protests have been so brutally suppressed in the name of like trying to get over with these protests as soon as possible, and to continue the image of stability. And of course, the system is also not invented by Turkey. So I just think that overall, when we look at all of these different dynamics, it's incredibly important in this context to look into the rise of high-security neoliberal nation-state systems, and to start thinking about what kind of rights, what kind of democracy do we want to understand from this system, and where actually there are different international policies, international institutions that might be generating local idiosyncrasies in terms of how they interpret neoliberalism and authoritarian and take authoritarian measures. But also we do need to look at the transnational context as well. And thank you.
Professor Yusuf, for very kind remarks. Our next speaker is Professor Türk Yılmaz. Please welcome Professor Türk Yılmaz, who will talk about neo-Ottoman tendencies in recent
First of all, I would like to also thank organizers for inviting me to be a part of this organization. It's a great honor to be here and sharing this panel with my colleague and friend Professor Aslı, and of course Professor Chomsky. And thank you very much for joining us on a Friday night. I didn't even think about that. But I guess my talk is a little less structured. Advance warning. And I'm an Ottoman historian, an Ottoman and early Republican historian by training. So I will try to provide an historical perspective to what's going on today. And I'm not sure if I'll answer what neo-Ottomanism exactly means, and I'm not sure if I find that concept term even useful. But I'll try to explain my reasons for not finding neo-Ottomanism as an exception, or as something that we can necessarily mark the AKP rule. So I would like to take you a century back to where Gezi all started, but kind of a century back. So among several reasons given at the beginning of at the construction of the shopping mall, I guess one point is later on became even more important. I don't know if you follow that, but the reconstruction of Topçu Barracks. And I mean, obviously there was a clear historical and ideological reference, but initially I guess that wasn't really clear to everybody. After especially the resistance started, people began to talk more and more about the historical significance of Topçu Kışlası and Topçu Barracks. Topçu Kışlası was exactly where Gezi Park is now, and it was demolished, I think around 1930s, 1940s, and then turned into the park as we know today. But Topçu Kışlası, if we were to talk about that place a century ago, we would be talking mostly about a political incident, 31st March incidents, a monumental moment marking for me actually the end of the Ottoman Empire as we know it, and starting a new point. And I'll try to explain why I think 31st March incidents were such a crucial turning point. For those of us who've gone through Turkish education system, and I believe that many of you have done so, I mean, 31st March incidents immediately rings bells, and we learn to categorize things according to their ideological significance, right? It's one of those events that tells us it was done. 31st March incidents was a mutiny that was started by a group of reactionary soldiers only 9 months after the establishment of constitutional regime, And these, soldiers were against the constitutional regime, and they were pro-Abdülhamid II, that despotic ruler, and then an army that was formed a voluntary army that was formed in the Balkans actually marched to the city and saved the constitution. So this is the narrative that we learn at elementary schools and high schools, at least my generation. So clearly we mark things, right? Abdülhamid was a dictator. He was a despotic ruler. His rule was known for espionage and carnage. And then the soldiers, the mutineer soldiers, were, also reactionary. Obviously within this whole thing, Topçu Barracks was where all started, right? I mean, these soldiers were stationed at the Topçu Barracks. So, in our minds, there's always, going back to that. And also, I guess, elementary schools, we also learned that Mustafa Kemal Atatürk was one of the soldiers in the action army that was the volunteer army coming from the Balkans. So we already hear about leaders of the republic. We began to see them as historic figures from action army, the arrival of action army onwards. So, but the way we learn it, it's almost a battle between the good and evil, right? Good versus, and we know whom the good guys were, and they won at the end. So, and the Topçu Barracks were where the final scene of this battle between good and evil took place. So, reconstruction, even an attempt to reconstruct that building, immediately rang bells, right? It can only mean one thing. It's the reversing the revolution. It's bringing that kind of fanatical, reactionary regime back. And by the way, actually, the very term reaction, using term reactionary for religious groups, what they referred as Islamist group, is actually a contribution of the 31st March incidents to our political vocabulary. So, this is where this term was created and applied to those groups that they associated with religion. So how did the Prime Minister respond to this kind of, reaction coming from clearly an ideological position, right? This kind of using the symbolic language. It's quite interesting that he actually played into that kind of, symbolic language and began to spoke within the stroke, right? This fight between the good and evil. And he said, we're not only going to reconstruct the Topçu Barracks, but we will also construct a mosque. Again, clearly playing into those kind of binaries, right? Because it's so reactionary. The only difference I would say is the good guys were different. So, what I would like to start with today, and I think it's extremely important to understand how we think about, how we function with these binaries, and perhaps it's time to move beyond these binaries and start speaking to each other. Let me try to complicate this story a little bit. Okay? So, actually, I happened to have studied 31st March incidents when I was doing my graduate work, and it was just, fair chance. I was doing research at the library, and I came across with a number of photos, a collection of photos from the 31st March incidents taken by a French consul at the time. And then I was very curious. It seemed to, use a little bit different language. If you actually, it's not very difficult. If you read a little bit into that period, and if you read the memoirs, if you, don't even need to go into the documents, one thing you would find out quite easily that the mutineer soldiers, that the first group that actually started what we call the reactionary movement, were not pro-Abdülhamid soldiers. Quite interestingly, these were soldiers, the members of 3rd Battalion, who were sent by the Balkan branch, not people of Balkan descent, but the CUP headquarters, military headquarters in the Balkans, to protect the constitutional regime. Right? So only 9 months after the constitutional regime, a group of soldiers who were sent from the center, from the Balkans, to safeguard the constitution, and they are starting an anti-constitutional rebellion against the constitutional regime, I find that quite perplexing. And it was only, obviously there was a religious language used, and obviously people who were associated with, pan-Islamist groups or using more of an, Islamic language became part of that. But I guess that's when kind of the initial movement went out of control. And, but by and large, I guess even the most anti-Abdülhamid II opponents at the time could not really establish any kind of link between Abdülhamid II and the movement itself. So, but at the end of this story, there was major events in the city. Actually, a member of the parliament was killed, lynched by the protesters. Abdülhamid II actually quite unexpectedly tried to calm the events, not further provoke it, and he tried to stay kind of, low profile, tried to keep a low profile, and he accused the, mutineer soldiers of being like janissaries, a term that, Ottoman sultans did not really like by that time. But eventually they managed to keep the calm in the city. But the action army that started in the Balkans did not stop its move. And they marched to the city, giving reassurances that their action, their movement, was to safeguard the constitution. We know that even as their march was continuing, it was a calm city. Obviously there was an anxiety, there was an expectation something awkward was going on. There was an army marching to the capital. But overall, there was nothing that would justify that kind of a movement. So, as far as I don't like conspiracy theories, and I definitely am not one of those who believe that history should be explained in terms of conspiracies. But I treat this point as the first coup of the Republic that wasn't even established. That was a coup, the first military coup of the Republic, 14 years before its establishment. This coup not only brought the CUP's military branch to the center and turned them into political actors, but it also gave us the language and the structures by which we understand binaries in our political system. So we use reactionary, we use constitutional, and they don't always mean the same thing. But quite interestingly, this was the first time that we saw the emergence of military as the safeguard, as the overseer of the constitutional regime in our political history. So the military saw itself above the law, above the constitution, but overseer of the constitution. And sometimes, as in the case of 31st March incidents, it meant that they would intervene, suspend the constitution to safeguard the constitution. And I guess that would sound very familiar to many of us that know it. Right. This was quite an illiberal beginning. So, rather than talking about 1908, the constitutional movement is the beginning of, the Republican system. I usually find this, better example because, all these names that we are more familiar with in the, single card period actually were the leaders of 31st March incidents, and I can give, Celal Bayar, İsmet Cedeso, and all the others. And Abdülhamid II was really the last sultan who ruled the Ottoman Empire as the system we know. So, why would we want to reconstruct Topçu Barracks if it is really the site of the first military coup and not necessarily the home of resistance or even the site of religious soldiers or the supporters of Abdülhamid. What is the purpose in commemorating or memorializing a site that is associated with that kind of an illiberal beliefs? Is it really that government is unaware of that kind of history? I'm not sure. I'm not sure. But I think there is, clearly, 31st March incidents marked the end of Abdülhamid and the Ottoman Empire and the beginnings of a new system. But I guess what we are doing right, what we are seeing unfolding in front of us right now is blurring that line, right? It's that kind of an interesting mixture of claiming a history that's an interesting convergence of the line of Abdülhamid II with the victory of the Iqtadists. And I don't know what the consequences of that be. I'm a historian. It would take another 10 years for me to analyze these. But I can tell you that I think there is something quite interesting happening right in front of us. There is this kind of a different kind of quoting the history. So this is, my first point, and I guess what I would like to argue in the rest of the paper is, this kind of separation and binary, thinking in binaries, reactionary versus secularist, neo-Ottoman versus Kemalist is not quite a useful, quite explanatory category. I guess what we are seeing is a marriage between the Abdülhamid II's pan-Islamist ideals and some sort of one-party systems, some sort of neo-Kemalist structure where we see a creation of a sacred state, sanctified state with a charismatic leadership that is above the individual, and that justifies and legitimizes the actions taken by the state. And Gezi movement, obviously Gezi resistance left a lot of us with many questions and many uncertainties, and I guess that was also a moment where I personally asked myself a lot of questions, not necessarily as a scholar, but a citizen of Turkey. And I will continue another point with, again, the 31st March incident, but I promise I will leave that history behind. So at the end of that, big battle, that, major battle, and you can read a lot about that, there's all these, memoirs written about that very last moment. So there were several casualties from both sides, both rebels and the Action Army. And these soldiers were buried. Some of them were buried at the Abide-i Hürriyet, the Statue of Liberty. But most of the soldiers were actually just for the, sake of convenience next to the barracks. And there was somewhat a discontent, a kind of, unhappy responses coming from the people that by that move, they were kind of mixing the bodies of Muslims with non-Muslims. And do you know why that was the case? There was an Armenian cemetery right next to the barracks. Right? And this was an Armenian cemetery that had existed there from 16th century onwards. And apparently it was there until 1933. And until Gezi movement, I didn't know about that. I personally didn't know about that. And I guess many people did not know about that either. So that takes me to my second point about what do we know and what we don't know about our history. And what does the change of property from one hand to the other tells us about break versus continuity between the Ottoman and Republican regime. When we are talking about the Ottoman system or neo-Ottoman model as so-called optimal model, we have certain ideas in mind, but we mostly talk about kind of a radical break between the Kemalist model and then, there's an AKP government that is trying to, bring back this reactionary model. But I will try to make a case for continuity, right? I mean, Gezi movement, clearly, I mean, the turning Gezi Park into a shopping mall / reconstruction of the barracks was clearly a confiscation move. I mean, at the last stage, as we know, Gezi Park, it was a public space that was shared by people. It wasn't the most pleasant park, perhaps, but it was a place that people spent time and had tea. And I mean, there was a kind of a civil marriage office there, and all kinds of stuff. But I mean, people were angry because that was confiscated, that was being taken away from that. But I guess this whole Armenian cemetery story also complicates the historical precedence of this confiscation stories. How many more layers of confiscation stories we are not aware of? Really, I mean, this very last stage of confiscation, is it less legitimate than the previous examples of confiscation? The very fact that they had been confiscated and turned into, one area or the other, does it justify what had been done? Right? Are we gonna try to understand what the confiscation of property or lack of, security of property in the Turkish context, in the Ottoman context, does to our political culture? It's not, I mean, I think there is a moral, ethical part to that. I think there's a political part to that as well. And I guess we take that part for granted. But I'm very curious to know, whether you also have the same kind of concerns. If your property is taken away from that, what else is taken away from that? I'm not trying to turn property as a defining moment of liberalism. But what I'm trying to question here is perhaps with these change of property changing hands from one hand to the other, perhaps that's leaving less of security, less of warranties for us to engage in the political culture. And it turns into, a power dynamic, a force in the hands of government, one government or the other, and to decide who is welcome in the city, who is welcome in the political culture, who is in and who is out. We've seen this with Armenians, we've seen this with Jews, we've seen this with Greeks, and perhaps we are seeing a different stage. But again, I don't think it's something that we figure out. Okay, I thought I would take just 15 minutes, but I guess I'm really going over time. I'll try to summarize the other 2 points I would like to make very quickly. Okay, shrinking territories. So another point that we often talk about when we are talking about a transition from the imperial to a nation state. And one of the things is obviously, as an Ottoman Empire, our ancestors ruled over large territories, and that it shrunk into a nation state, right? And some people are happy with that, and there's ways of feeling good about it, and there are others who are not. But I guess in terms of state tradition, it wouldn't be an exaggeration to call that there is an anxiety embedded in the political regime that is felt by both the single party politicians, single party state functionaries, the ones that came after that, and even now. The one example that always, one reference point is to the loss of Crete, and often, in the case of Cyprus, the Crete is a referential point, right? And what we've seen in the single-party era and in the following, period right after that, we know that non-Muslims of this country, especially the Greeks, were held hostage because of that cartographic anxiety, right? The anxiety that the state officials felt about changing borders. Non-Muslims were the fifth column actors. And I guess now we are seeing a similar activity, same kind of anxiety felt with another group. I'm not sure how that works in the minds of current state officials, AKP's bureaucrats. But I feel like with this Turkey's involvement in the especially Arab Middle East, it started as a zero problem neighbors policy, but as we all know, with the political movements in different parts of the Arab Middle East, it immediately turned into a almost problem with every context, every country in the region. But with especially the problem rising in Syria, we began to hear more and more about the Alevis. Okay. So we knew that Alevis were there, we knew that they are there, but we didn't really talk about Alevis, right? And recently, as you know, there was a package issue, democratization package issue, and we know that Alevis are included in the next package, and I probably won't have time about problems that's associated with democratizing the country with packages and not introducing some sort of universal individual rights. But I guess another continuity point is seeing Alevis as a group of error, as an anomaly that you can trace from the Abdülhamid II through Kemalist era up until today. For the Abdülhamid II, Alevis were a group that needs to be ethnographically studied and then converted because they were led astray and they were heretics. During the Kemalist era, these were people of real Turkish origin, but somehow led astray, and then they had to be, especially Dersim, had to be converted by force, using military force, by eradicating Dersim. And now, again, Alevis appear in the so-called neo-Ottoman policy as the kind of hostages, as the kind of fifth column activity, fifth column for what's going on in Syria. And here again, just like what we've seen in 31st March incidents, we are creating categories. Arab-speaking Alevis are not same group of people with the Turkish and Kurdish-speaking Alevis. But now we have this umbrella category that puts all these people together because of the anxiety that our state feels, not necessarily these people. As far as Kurdish policy, and I think, again, a serious continuity between the Kemalists and the current government, and I think it's a divergence and not convergence with Abdülhamid II. Abdülhamid II actually thought that perhaps Kurds were a little wild, but they were reliable elements, and I guess there's a disagreement on that issue, and AKP's policies regarding Kurds have not been significantly different from the Kemalists. I guess as a concluding note, what I would say, I think our problem is not seeing this as a binary, as a system, as a now Ottomanist model that is trying to undo the Kemalist regime. It's actually, in quite ironic and interesting ways, is building onto the Kemalist structure and Kemalist model. It's the strong state that defines who the ideal citizen is. And the ideal citizen is still the Turkish Sunni that for the Republican, we added the Republican brand to that, but now it is Turkish Sunni and perhaps more practicing than the average. But at the end, it's the same kind of policies. What changed, and I guess that partly explains what's going on today, is that it's just our government, our state is more controlling, more powerful, and has more technologies to interfere in the lives of individuals. And they have more power to transform the individual. And I guess that's what's happening. And rather than dividing the society into religious versus secularist, Turk versus Kurd, Alevi versus non-Alevi Sunni, I guess it's time to talk about universal rights that limits the interference of the state, limits the state, not individuals' rights. And I guess it's time to talk about giving more freedoms, not defining the freedoms of individuals, whether it's freedom of expression, freedom of practice, freedom of belief, or freedom of conscience. It's time to talk about, limiting the state's control over our individual lives. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Türkılmaz, for your comments, and we apologize for the technical difficulties we are experiencing, but we'd like to take, before we move on to Professor Chomsky, we'd like to take 1 minute to try to fix the problem.
Robotics that enables us to, will soon allow us to have fly-sized drones on the ceiling carrying out surveillance in our living rooms. And then there are hard problems, like getting a sound system. Anyone who's been to an MIT commencement knows that there's almost a guarantee that the sound system will be well, I'm not a specialist on Turkey. I won't talk much about Turkish history. In the last 15 years, I've visited Turkey repeatedly, and have gotten a kind of a snapshot view of quite interesting and significant changes that have been taking place. My first visit was about 15 years ago, was at the end of, near the end of a very dark period in Turkish history. There had been a huge state terror operation through the 1990s aimed at the Kurdish population in southeastern Turkey. Tens of thousands of people were killed, several thousand towns and villages were destroyed, every kind of torture that you can imagine. There were hundreds of thousands, maybe millions of refugees driven to Western Turkey or beyond. I visited slums in Istanbul, which people in Istanbul don't know about, in areas where there are condemned buildings that are in fact inhabited by the Kurdish refugees from the east. Families living in a family living in a small room where nobody, the father, mother, young child cannot leave the room. It's too dangerous outside. There were in some of these places teenage children who did go out to earn some money. I hate to think what they were doing, but they could more or less survive. I was told by the people there that they could go back to their destroyed villages and reconstruct them. They were allowed to do that, but only on one condition, that they signed statements saying that the villages had been destroyed by the Kurdish guerrillas, PKK, which of course wasn't true. They were destroyed by the Turkish army, and refusing to sign these statements, they were consigned to the slums, where worse than slums, where they'll presumably be there forever. I went on a couple of times to Diyarbakir, the kind of semi-official capital of Turkey in the southeast. There were people living in the city surrounded by walls. There were people living in caves in the walls. We were followed by a lot of security and Turkish security, also television. And my guides, one of them, the head of Human Rights Watch in Turkey, if they noticed down a street that there were children playing whose clothes, the combination of their clothes matched the Kurdish flag, they would steer us in another direction, because the parents could suffer for allowing children's clothes that might suggest the Kurdish flag. And I did give a talk in Diyarbakir the first time I was there, town hall, and at the end of the talk, something very dramatic happened. It was a discussion, and a couple of young men came up carrying a book. It was a Kurdish English dictionary, which was banned in Turkey, so it was illegal. It had been smuggled in from France and had an inscription in the front, which, moving inscription, the book's in my office if anyone wants to see it, just expressing their wish that someday they would be able to use their own language. This is a very courageous act in front of Turkish security and television. I tried to find out later what happened to them. A couple of weeks later they were arrested and disappeared after that. I haven't been able to trace it further. My first visit was to take part supposedly to observe a trial. It was a trial of a publisher who had translated published a translation of a book of mine. The book had about 10 pages or so on Turkey, covering the atrocities of the preceding decade, the 1990s. So he was under, the publisher and its owner were tried. The trials are before a military court, which has no resemblance to a court. His lawyer, Osman Baydemir, later the mayor of Diyarbakir, more recently arrested in the recent wave of arrest, his lawyer suggested that I should insist on being a co-defendant in the trial. He assumed, turned out correctly, that if I did, the government would call off the trial because they didn't want the publicity. There was a lot of international press around for that event. So I did, and sure enough, the next day we walked into the courtroom and the prosecutor informed the judge that they were dropping the charges, and the trial ended. A very temporary victory, because a couple of months later he was arrested and tried again, and hard to find out what happened to him. On the way out, I learned something interesting about the International Press Corps. There was a lot of international press there, including some American journalists. They were there for the spectacle. And when the trial was called off, they all walked out. As we were walking out, the police were bringing in a young woman. I stopped to talk to her. It turned out she's a journalist who was being tried before the same court. If the press had been willing to stay there for another 20 minutes, she probably would have been released. Because, again, for the same reason, they don't want the publicity. But not a single journalist was willing to spend 20 minutes to save a young colleague from being sent to a Turkish prison, which is not very pleasant, with whatever followed. Well, these were some of the worst atrocities of the 1990s, and the U.S. was involved up to its neck. 80% of Turkey's arms that were used for the atrocities were coming from the United States, Clinton administration. The atrocities peaked in 1997. In 1997, Clinton sent the level of arms sent to Turkey in 1997 was about the same as the total shipment of arms to Turkey in the entire Cold War period up to the onset of the counterinsurgency, the state terror. All of this is unknown here. There were, of course, news bureaus in Turkey and Ankara, but they wouldn't report it. Actually, one of the very few people to have written about it, to write about it at the time, was John Terman, who's now head of the Center for International Studies here. It was unknown for two reasons. First of all, it's typical that the press does not want to report and academics do not want to discuss our own crimes. It's much nicer to talk about other people's crimes. Also, this was enhanced here because there was a preferred story. The 1990s were right after the fall of the Soviet Union, and the story was that Now the United States is free to demonstrate its profound commitment to principles and values, to act on the basis of altruism alone, to lead the enlightened states as they can now. They're free to disregard international law and the Security Council and carry out their marvelous missions. Led by the New World, bent on a crusade to end inhumanity. Clinton's foreign policy was described as having a saintly glow as it entered into a noble phase. These are all quotes from leading international left liberal, mostly intellectuals. That was the preferred story. And it's not nice to disturb the preferred story with a dose of reality, of which the crucial, decisive U.S. participation in Turkish atrocities is one and only one example. In fact, all of this episode is so embarrassing that it's been erased from history. Can't find any reference to it. Well, in the early years of this millennium, there were improvements. As you visited year by year, you see detectable improvements in the human rights condition. The attacks on the Kurds declined, the circumstances improved, Diyarbakir was much more open. As I say, Osman Baydemir was elected mayor. That continued until about 2005. At that point, there was a very clear shift. Most analysts in Turkey attribute that, I think, plausibly, to the fact that in 2005, the European Union made it pretty clear that no matter what improvements there were in Turkish human rights behavior, the EU was not going to admit Turkey as a member. As the pretext for not allowing them was human rights violations, of which members of the European Union are not immune to charges about that, but Turkey didn't reach their high standards. As the standards improved, the bar went higher. And it was pretty clear that the real reason was just plain European racism. The Europeans don't want Turks walking around the streets. That became quite obvious in Germany in particular. There was a government minister, Thilo Sarrazin, published a book which quickly became a bestseller in Germany, protesting that the Turks were not becoming Germans. They weren't. They were still keeping their own culture and staying together. Angela Merkel, the chancellor, chimed in and, of course, condemned the book. Everyone had to condemn the book. But she said it was true. Multiculturalism had failed. Turks were not, to put it metaphorically, becoming blonde and blue-eyed. Therefore, it was a real problem. Those with a sense of irony might bear in mind that Benjamin Franklin, the leading Enlightenment figure in the early days of the United States, argued that Germans should not be allowed to immigrate to the United States because they're too swarthy. Swedes, too. They're too swarthy to immigrate. But today it's Turks who can't be accepted in Europe, so Turkey was not going to be admitted no matter what. And the Turkish policy changed notably at that time, possibly for that reason. It became there was a return to a serious repression, up to the events that you've recently been hearing about. U.S. attitudes towards Turkey also changed. During the period of the huge atrocities in the 90s, there was virtually no coverage. But after 2003, there was a beginning of retrospective coverage of Turkish atrocities, always, of course, excising the U.S. role. That's unmentionable. So what was the reason? Well, there was a reason. Turkey committed a major crime in 2003, which was unforgivable. The Turkish government, to everyone's surprise, followed the will of 90%, 95% of the population and refused to participate in the U.S. invasion of Iraq. That's a real crime. Killing tens of thousands of people and so on, we don't care about that. But following the will of the overwhelming majority of the population is a major crime. And Turkey was bitterly condemned for that. Sanctions were suggested. Paul Wolfowitz, a government official who was known here as, he was called the idealist in chief, leading the alleged democracy movement of the Bush administration. He went so far as to personally condemn the Turkish military because they didn't overthrow the government and force it to carry out their duty of following the United States and invading Iraq on the pretext that 95% of the population disagreed. So at that point, it did become possible to start describing some of the atrocities of the 90s, of course, excising the U.S. role. And then, as repression increased in Turkey, U.S. relations with the government also improved. That's pretty normal and characteristic. And the repression became pretty severe, as you've heard. As you just heard, Turkey now has the highest per capita imprisonment for terror by quite a long shot. The organization Reporters Without Borders published an annual report of repression of journalists around the world. Last year they published it, and they also published a special supplement specifically about Turkey. It was entitled "Turkey, World's Biggest Prison for Journalists." The report was based on an intensive study. It concluded, I'll quote, that the number of detained journalists is unprecedented since the end of military rule, mostly representatives of the Kurdish media. That was one aspect of rising repression. Altogether, there were mass arrests of political activists, particularly Kurds, including mayors, former parliamentarians, and so on. The U.S., as usual, is participating. It's no secret to anyone, or it shouldn't be, that the Obama administration has gone out of its way to lead a major attack on civil liberties in the United States. And one of the most extreme cases, which is not as well known as it should be, involves Turkey. It's a Justice Department case brought by, it's called Holder versus Humanitarian Law Project. It's a case brought by the Obama administration against the Humanitarian Law Project. That's a legal aid association which was committing the crime of providing legal advice to a Turkish organization that's on the U.S. terrorist list. That's too much for the Obama administration. Read the court case, it could pretty well condemn as a terrorist anyone in the U.S. who, say, advises a group on the terrorist list to turn to nonviolent actions or just investigates them out of an interest in research. I've done that. Others might. We might incidentally ask ourselves, that's a very sharp attack on freedom of speech and civil rights. We might ask ourselves, just what is the terrorist list? As you heard, the Turkish version of what's a terrorist is leading to a huge wave of imprisonment. The U.S. terrorist list is also an interesting phenomenon. It's assumed here to be legitimate. The government can put anyone it likes on the terrorist list without judicial review, without argument, take anyone off that it likes. It should be regarded as a scandal, particularly when you look at how it's used. So, for example, Nelson Mandela was on the terrorist list until about 4 years ago. If he wanted to come to the United States, he had to have special dispensation. And the reason is that the Reagan administration, toward the very end of the apartheid years, condemned the African National Congress, Mandela's African National Congress, as one of the more notorious terrorist groups in the world. That was Reagan's justification for providing aid and assistance to apartheid South Africa to defend themselves from the terror of the ANC. On the other hand, take Saddam Hussein. He was removed from the terrorist list in 1982 by the Reagan administration because they wanted to provide substantial aid to Saddam in his invasion of Iran. So therefore he had to be removed from the terrorist list. That left a gap in the terrorist list, so they had to put someone in. And what they did was put Cuba in. That was in honor of the fact that Cuba is the target of more international terrorism than all states in the world combined, coming from the United States. And in fact, there had just been a huge upsurge in terrorism against Cuba, so they were put on the terrorist list as Saddam Hussein was removed, and Mandela was put on a couple of years later. It was just recently taken off. That's the terrorist list. The fact that we pay attention to it here is pretty amazing. Well, then comes Taksim Square, Gezi Park. Heard about that. Meanwhile, I should say that throughout this whole period, there have been enormous changes among the Turkish public. It's pretty remarkable to see. I won't go through the details, but I was just there a couple of months ago, most recently, and right before the Taksim Square events. I was there as to give a lecture, and a memorial lecture for Hrant Dink. Hrant Dink is the journalist who began to expose the truth about the atrocities against the Armenians, which had been hidden and denied and so on. He was assassinated almost surely by government agents. There was some story concocted which nobody believed. This was a memorial lecture, huge turnout, big march through Istanbul, ended with a huge demonstration in front of the building where Hrant Dink worked and where he was assassinated, with signs, we are all Hrant Dink. And meanwhile, there has been a considerable exposure of the crimes committed for the first time, and also actions taken. So when I was in Diyarbakir 10 years ago, I was interested in. Diyarbakir is one of the places where the massacres were really peaked. It was horrible massacres there. So I asked if there was any remnant of the Armenian community, and I was taken to a church, or the ruins of a church. Virtually nothing left. The roof gone, a couple of pillars. And that was the main Armenian church. I asked if anyone had collected anything from the church before it was destroyed, and they told me that took me to a storefront nearby. It was an Armenian man in his 80s who had collected artifacts from the church. That's what was left of the Armenian community. Last time I was there, early this year, I discovered that activists in Turkey had have a foundation which had rebuilt the church, rebuilt the Armenian church, was trying to reconstruct the truth about what happened, and also the remnants of the Armenian community. These are very significant developments. When you took a look at knowing anything about this, the enormous protests at Taksim Square were not that much of a surprise. Very brave, very courageous, brutally repressed, as you heard, but not a surprise. Another element of this is, we should bear in mind, is a very striking fact about Turkey is it's the only country I know where with leading intellectuals, leading writers, artists, journalists, academics, publishers, have constantly been protesting the atrocities and the crimes, and not only protesting but engaged in active resistance against them, facing imprisonment, sometimes enduring it. That's not a lot of fun, but they keep going, no matter how bad the impression was. I don't know of any other country like that. It's very impressive and a lesson. And in fact, all of this I think, teaches us a lot, Americans here, that we can learn about our own record, what it's actually like, what we've been doing in the world, and also what can be done to change it under much harsher conditions than we endure.
Thank you, Professor Chomsky, for your remarks. And we will next open up the floor for questions. To maximize participation in the limited amount of time that we have, we're going to have some rules here. And the most important rule to keep in mind is that the person who gets to the front of the line and has the microphone has 1 minute, okay, to ask a question or give a reaction. And after 1 minute, I'll be rather authoritarian in actually enforcing this rule. We'll have to cut you off. And in addition to that rule, I will also encourage you to use your limited time perhaps to ask a single question, as opposed to multiple questions or long-winded comments. A single question that would make our panel react would be ideal for us, but it's up to you how you would like to use your 1 minute. And with that, so we're going to have the questions over here, so if you could line up on the stairway, and that would be great. The person who comes to the front can ask the first question.
Mine will be a little personal question to Dr. Chomsky. I'm really amazed by seeing you, how closely you continue to follow every country on the world and, know about the details, especially given that even the mass media doesn't cover quite a bit in the countries themselves. I'm really curious about what is your source of information, from which sources you follow what's going on around the world.
There's no secrets. You can look up the same sources.
Yeah, which sources are they? That's what. Which news media?
Take say the atrocities of the 90s, okay? Mm-hmm. Human Rights Watch, which happened to have a very good researcher in Turkey, Jonathan Sugden, published extensive details of the atrocities year by year. Amnesty International published them. Other international human rights groups did. The Turkish intellectuals were releasing a huge amount of information on it. That takes courage, because they could be imprisoned for it, and many were. There were plenty of sources of information. In fact, the Turkish government provided information. One of the Turkish ministers, in fact, gave a famous speech in which he condemned the Turkish actions as state terror. They were destroying towns, villages, burning forests. It was just a horror story. It was flooded with information. New York Times didn't publish a word. I mentioned John Turman. He was one of the very few people who published about it. Jonathan Randall was famous international correspondent. He's worked in Turkey. He must have been in France at the time. He published material about it. There's no shortage of information.
Great. Thank you very much. I should say, even many Turks don't know much about what you have just described.
Yeah, that's not entirely true. I was struck the first time I was there, when the repression was still pretty high. I was invited to national television and asked leading questions, soft questions, essentially asking me to talk about the terror and the atrocities, which they couldn't talk about. But obviously they knew enough to try to elicit the questions. So I'm not sure how much wasn't known.
Hello, thank you for the talks. I have a question actually to speakers in general. And I do appreciate the criticism for Turkish government and actually the sensitivity for Armenians and Kurdish people in Turkey. And my question would be, if you were to comment about why people went on the streets and they started screaming all together, and there were even Turkish people, Kurdish people, and Armenians, and what would you say about this? Like, if you were to comment what people felt about, like, Ghazi and Taksim? Oh, sorry. Can I repeat? So I'm saying, if you were to comment about what people felt instead of the government and all these historical problems for Kurdish and Armenian people, what would you say? Why did people get together and started a kind of reaction against government? And I believe for everything, what is going on in Turkey. I mean, I kind of feel the lack of discussion for what people felt on the streets, other than what government did and what all these like political things happened in the history. And I would just like to raise this issue.
Anyone at the panel would like to take this question?
I'm really not the right person to answer. I can tell you what my friends felt, and the people I met, and the people who showed up at meetings and so on. But as somebody who knows Turkey better than I do, should really answer this.
Not that I know better, but I can give it a try. I guess, many people had different, reasons and different feelings about why they were there. And I guess that's why it's important. I guess what brought and, what we call ulusalcı, this, group of people, nationalists, secularist nationalists, ran with, let's say, anti-capitalist Muslims. I guess they had very little in common, but I guess I think the general feeling, our sense at least while I was there, people were kind of, I guess I'm feeling unhappy about the control that they felt in their lives, and I guess that's a common denominator. It doesn't even matter who you are. They felt that there is a surveillance, that you have to really fit a certain type to be, the acceptable citizen, and that leaves very little room for action, for feelings, for people, and I guess one other thing is the language, the politic language of the politics that's becoming increasingly personal. And the very strong language used by the Prime Minister, I guess, was something that did not rub the people in the right way.
I unfortunately arrived too late in August, so but what I can say and I was glued to my computer, as I'm sure many of us were who were interested in the incidents. I think that it is not unprecedented that so many different people with so many different motivations came together and reacting against something. And I think that it would be difficult to state for me. Obviously, when you have so many different people with different motivations and aspirations coming together, you will have many different stories to tell. So I would think that part of the story was maybe to react against the increasing control, but also I think the brutality with which they were met. And I think that every time there was more brutality, there were more people pouring into the streets, as far as I could tell from, my conversations with people who were on the ground. But more than that, I think would be presumptuous for me.
We are going to answer all the questions for those.
Unfortunately, Professor Chomsky had to leave, but we still have 15 more minutes for questions, so please, you're welcome to take questions.
So thank you for the valuable comments, which Professor Chomsky will be here also. But anyhow, I just would like to underline one thing. In 2003, it was not the government who opposed the bill. It was a group of parliamentarians inside the governing party who resisted the bill, and it was rejected by a meager majority. So it was a very narrow majority. So I just wanted to underline that. Recep Tayyip Erdogan was as pro-US as he is today, in 10 years ago. So the question would be, in Gezi Park movement, we had a very strong opposition movement, an overarching opposition movement, which included anti-capitalist Muslims and ultra-nationalists and liberals and leftists at the same time. But the question is how to solidify this opposition, since we have a very solid governing party with a solid electorate body, how to solidify the opposition in the face of the strong government hold of its electorate body and how to win elections, or at least to defend the rights of the people who are against the government in this current situation with solidifying this opposition movement? That's my question.
Thank you. Councillor Daniel.
I think that, for me, I could only speak theoretically because I don't know. And anyone who could actually think of a positive or like a productive way to approach this, I think, would be more than welcome to join into this conversation. But I think that it is also not unprecedented. Again, when in 2002 AK Party won the elections, they won the elections with a big, collaboration with many different constituencies, actually, who came together, who were actually fed up by, the state of the affairs, and for many different reasons. So it has been done. So the question is, maybe, is there a candidate that many people could feel comfortable to endorse to break this maybe cycle? But I think the most important thing of all for me that I can think of, as beyond a candidate of like a opposition figure, the most important thing that I could think of is actually people starting to question what is it that they actually want, and what actually would be plausible to posit as their rights, and to actually start from there. Because, okay, we all want some more freedom, but some people's request for freedom is fringing on it. Like, this is an non-ending story. I really think that the most important thing is to start thinking about a concrete way of organizing, and that each group does it the way they feel right to them, and to build it from there. And to question the state structures. Because if you look at from the very beginning of the founding of the Republic of Turkey till now, what you see is a very actually a state structure that actually brought people to power, and then something happens to them along the way. If you were actually, I don't count the military coups, of course, that was obvious. It was, dictatorship and authoritarian and everything. But, if you were to put into the same room Kemal Atatürk, İsmet İnönü, Menderes, Kenan Evren, Tayyip Erdoğan, I think they would all end up fighting with each other. And yet, there is something in this, you don't agree, but I think that there is something that seems to me that is enabling in the state structure this authoritarian tendency to flourish. And I think that each group feels like once the other group is going to take power, their rights will be infringed upon. And so they have this impetus of trying to seize power, become hegemony. And I think maybe we need to start talking about a tradition of maybe democracy and what we want in that context. Good luck.
I'll be very brief. I don't think Gezi is a replicable experience. I think in the sense that, many different groups came together and then they stayed together for a while, even after Gezi was brutally demolished and destructed. But the last month, if you've been following the news, you see that there are now more clear divisions among the groups that they were there and they were kind of peacefully there. I don't think that's unhealthy. I think in the sense that, as long as people, groups, different politics continue building up their own polity, I don't think there's a problem. Different people don't need to stay together. And I think the problem would be turning this, is the problem is only with AKP, and if we get rid of AKP, then everything is going to be, fine. I think that will be just, a temporary solution, because we've seen this before. I think the important thing is to, at least for me, is to find a politics that I'm comfortable with and, move with that, and not necessarily, yes to coalitions, but not without limits or without, some ethical, moral issues involved.
Maybe I can say a quick word about that as well. So I was yesterday at a talk by a sociologist, Professor Zeynep Tüfekçi, and her point was that she's analyzing the common patterns across various mass protests that we see in different countries, Tunisia, Egypt, Turkey. And what's common here is that many people take out to the streets using social media and new technological opportunities, and on the surface this looks like a very big movement, but it's not necessarily followed with the same kind of change that you would see in the historical instances of similar movements. So technology now makes it very easy for people to take to the streets, but the next step requires a certain organizational capacity, which many of these protests don't necessarily have. So I think the next step in Turkey, in the case of Turkey, capacities and to direct them into making positive changes to improve. For our group, for instance, it would be to improve pluralistic democracy in Turkey. But we can take the next question now.
So my first question will be for Zeynep. During the talks, we didn't have a chance to talk about Gezi Parkı a lot. I know you were personally there, so my question will be very brief and short. So what makes Gezi Parkı so special and historical in the history of Turkey? And my second question will be about the talk of the Aslı, neoliberalism. So they say that the history ended after Soviet Union collapsed, and the people started to resist again at the end of 90s in Seattle, and the anti-war movement made it even broader and larger. The people are going on resisting in Greece, Spain, Turkey, or of course in Egypt. But we couldn't achieve the change. For instance, in Latin America they did, but in Europe we were not able to change it. So you were preparing yourself to talk about also a new internationalism, a new solidarity. So could you also speak about the resistance movements in the next 10 years? And also, what is your perspective? Thank you.
Again, I think I'll be very brief. But I guess I've already said what I think it makes Gezi special, and I guess that's its ability to bring people of all different walks together and let them stay together under not the best conditions for a long period of time. I mean, uniting people around the cause, and that, people were very open about their identities. So everything could be, it was really one place that you can freely express whoever you were. And I guess that was really unique and unusual about Gezi. And I kind of disagree on that I don't think that kind of a thing is very common. Perhaps with the Arab Springs we saw, similar movements initially in Egypt that, people were together. But I guess here, anti-capitalist Muslims were really an impressive group that could be on the discourse of victimhood that we hear very often in Turkey, and could move beyond the question, where were you when I was being, victimized by the government? And I guess that was quite inspiring, and I guess uniting around the cause without necessarily, inserting yourself, but also making your difference and your voice and your presence visible was a unique opportunity.
Thank you for your less than 1 minute but huge question, which I don't know how to answer. But first of all, I want to say something, and thank you for bringing this up, because what I meant by different groups coming together is not unprecedented, was not the Gezi protests, but actually different groups coming together in a political coalition to support some figure. But yeah, I didn't mean to say that about the Gezi protests. As for your question, I do think that we need to have an international collaboration and discussion about what is going on. If we keep treating the Turkish case as a isolated case, if we keep treating the Spanish case as an isolated case, I don't know, the Greek case and the Egyptian, these are all, I think, all different in their own ways, but there are different, I think, also elements and patterns that you can see, the ways in which they are organized, the ways in which they are actually dealing with either, some authoritarian regimes which were supported during, Cold War era, so the residues of those policies, or in today's context, some of the neoliberal policies in different venues. And of course, each locale has its own idiosyncrasy. But a new way of talking about, I think, internationalism, how to come together and to actually start questioning where the world is going, really. Where actually all these brand finance, I was really actually surprised to find out that there were those brand valuation consultancies that were hierarchizing different countries. What does that do to, countries? What does that do to, how governments are, setting up their, how they imagine their position with their citizens abroad, and this big concern with image and so on and so forth. And also at the same time, when we have all these, different measures taken in the name of counterinsurgencies, like with, anti-terror laws, states of exception. There are many examples of this that we can think about it today. And the militarized riot police, the growth of non-lethal technologies. This is, it seems to me that there are many elements here that we can take into account and to start really building on this, because I think it is very important to initiate a language where actually different groups come together, because otherwise I don't see how a world system can change. And I don't think we can change it, but maybe at least we can start talking about it. Not that we are not, but maybe do it in a more organized way.
This is obviously meant for Chomsky, but somewhat I feel that our speakers will get from the speakers I will get a better or more objective answer. To give a context to my question, I think a winner of these Gezi protests is international rights organizations, especially those who are based in the US. People who came into politics, formerly apolitic people who came into politics by Gezi protests, have a very high positive and I think uncritical opinion about these rights organizations. And the question comes, Human Rights Watch on the 10th of October published a document or a report which points the finger to Turkey's support for Al-Qaeda related extremist groups in Syria, and blaming Turkey for giving support to them and their outrageous atrocities and so on. And as far as my search on the online records show, and on the other hand, we know that, everybody knows that it's a widely known secret that Turkey has been supporting these groups almost for 1.5 years or almost 2 years, maybe more. This is how we can find. This is how long we know. And as far as my search on the online records show, it is only now that Human Rights Watch is mentioning such kind of support, and there is no mention in the Amnesty International. Do you see any significance to this latency? And is there a function of international rights organizations in the general framework of US foreign policy?
Would you like to take that question, Zeynep, or Asna?
I was trying.
Okay. I don't know, I'm not sure. I mean, yes, human rights organizations obviously are also based in a certain context, and they are also part of the, imperial story. They're not free from these, imperial stories. There is no pure altruistic enterprise. We can hope for that. But in this specific case, I don't think I know enough to say that was there is a reason for that kind of latency. It might be.
Sorry, just 1 week after the report, Turkish armed forces started bombing Al-Qaeda units in Syria.
I mean, recently they started bombing, like 2 days ago or so.
Yeah, just 1 week after the report, which was
yeah, but I think there were also negotiations going on with the US on that, on that. It's not just human rights. I mean, there were already, I guess, if you've been following, there were some reports about, the head of Turkish intelligence service and his involvement with this neo-Ottomanist enterprise that, Turkish army was in all kinds of these operations, but yeah.
I also don't know, because I didn't look into it very closely, but I would imagine that, because Amnesty International, or, I don't mean to say any particular group, but usually I think they operate with countries, and I think that their hands were full in the context of Turkey, I imagine. Of course, human rights is a regime, and of course it has its own implications, and this is not to undermine the hard work that a lot of people involved in it are trying to conduct, but regardless, I mean, it's part of the system as well. So that's all I can say, I think, at this point.
Syria was quite an interesting case, and again, the story of good guys versus bad guys is quite complicated.
It's very complicated.
And only recently they are talking about, Alevis that were
killed by the Islamist, Al-Qaeda and those kind of groups, and it's because, I mean, there was this myth of, rebels that, liberation army kind of myth that didn't take us too far, I guess.
We're running out of time, so maybe we will take the 3 people who are waiting for questions, assuming that they're going to be quick, and then we're going to end in 10 minutes, okay? Yeah, just the 3 people waiting. That's what I can say.
I'll be really quick. So this is a question that has been occupying my mind for the most part of my life in the last few months. Basically, we Turkish dissidents, so to speak, always talk about how marginalized we are and how we cannot find our place in the existing political structures and existing political parties even. And I was just going to ask you how you would suggest that we could reconfigure, so to speak, our existing ties with the political center as being people from the margins.
I mean, I'll try to be very short, but I mean, it's obviously, again, a big question. And I guess, on the one hand, we have to recognize what the Turkish have suffered. I mean, it's not like we didn't have any kind of opposition that was part of the masses, but, the Turkish left suffered from each and every coup that happened in Turkey. Although we often classify the coups that was against the right and against the left, but at the end, if you actually historically look, each of those coups actually targeted the leftist groups. So in a way, there is a historical reason for that kind of isolation, that kind of losing touch. That's not to justify the attitude of some of the left or some of the dissidents that kind of moved more to the kind of cut their ties with the urban poor, for example, for cultural reasons, or failed to understand the Kurdish problem or the Armenian problem. But I guess all those, at least some groups, some dissident groups, suffer from the official ideology, and that's probably explains part of that. But we also need to recognize that they've been suffering from one blow after the other. I guess the way to move beyond that is actually coming to terms with the history and starting from scratch. And going to the neighborhoods, trying to understand the people and not just hear what you have in your mind. And I guess that's the most difficult part. And I guess the Gezi was important for that reason as well, because a lot of people for the first time were listening to each other.
I want to make a comment on Aslı Hoca's talk. So you mentioned that the role of the Chamber of Architects and Engineers were taken over by the Environment and Urbanization Ministry. and you mentioned afterwards that Erdogan had an international reputation going towards being a dictator afterwards. I was at a talk this summer at TOB, which is the Union of Chambers and Commodity Exchanges of Turkey, and World Bank and IFC were there along with the environment people. And they were talking as if none of this had happened, as if, everything was perfect. I felt like I was the only person in the room who felt Erdogan was what I believe he is. And in addition, Obama invited Erdogan and his entire family 3 days after Reyhanlı happened to America without saying anything about Reyhanlı. So am I the only one who thinks Erdogan is a dictator, or is there any international, actual implementation of Erdogan as a dictator mentality?
Thank you. Here is the problem, I think, where I agree with you, is that I don't say there is no rise of authoritarianism, and I'm not saying that there is no concentration of power, but I don't find it productive to just personalize a systemic problem, because I don't think what is happening in Turkey currently cannot be thought disjointedly from all the government personnel, that from different layers of the government, and from the different bureaucrats that they have actually appointed and assigned and designated. And I think that they all take part, every kind of rule of law that is AK Party passed the right to give a decree law to the cabinet. So all these people are actually part of this. If we actually, only concentrate on one person's impetus in this, and try to personalize this, I think that we miss the opportunity to ask the rest of the legislators and the parliamentarians to be also accountable for what is happening. I think that this is the number one. The number two, of course, in the international arena, we do know that, different countries have, I don't know about the context of the invitation that you were mentioning, but it is not unprecedented that different countries had partnerships with or collaborations with, leaders who have authoritarian tendencies, until this becomes unjustifiable in the eyes of international arena. Then they just realize, oh my God, what is happening here? So I think that rather than talking about whether he's a dictator or not, it is, which I don't, technically it's not the case. But rather than talking about this, I think it is much more productive to actually break apart how this system works, and then start thinking about how you're going to address those. That's what I find more productive. But thank you for your question.
Last question.
Hi, this is a very specific question. So, both of you and Professor Chomsky have delineated tonight the abuses of power by the Turkish government, and essentially the numerous things that have led to the recent social unrest in Turkey, and particularly tonight, you've been speaking about oppression against the ethnic minorities, the 1990s atrocities against the Kurds, and the homogenization of the Alevis and so forth, and of course the Armenian problem goes unsaid. And all of these things put together, in addition to even more, I guess, superficial things like Erdogan's comments about airline stewardesses not being able to wear a certain shade of lipstick or something, whatever it was he said. There was one incident in the prior decade that really shocked me, that did get international attention, which was the destruction of Silikule and the relocation of the Roma population to housing projects 30 miles outside of downtown Istanbul. I wondered if you could talk about that, because that seems like one of them, to me, to a non-Turk, to a Westerner observing by proxy, one of the most important events that kind of led to the pot boiling over.
I think that what was very interesting is that the gentrification of the neighborhood had begun already in mid-2000s. So that was like, well, actually the project was, you know, in the making by that time. And when Istanbul was elected as European Capital of Culture in 2006 to serve this, like to perform this in 2010, one of the things that, if you analyze the application dossier of the Turkish, of Istanbul, basically, one of the things that you actually notice there is that there was this, Anglo-European multiculturalism that was rediscovered in Ottoman history as a history of tolerance. So there I saw like one indication of Kurds in that application dossier. And so just before I speak about that, one of the biggest arguments that the Istanbul dossier was making was that, well, we are European, we have been historically part of Europe with the Ottoman Empire, and we are also diverse and multicultural. And that was actually one of the things that the European Union project was also highlighting. And I'm also very critical of that project as well. It's very celebratory and everything, because while all of these things were happening, again, I'm opening a parenthesis here, there was a big exhibition in Brussels, and I believe it was in 2009, if I'm not mistaken. And around that time, it was like the reintegration of the Roma to Europe and everything. So this is not only in Turkey. That was happening, and as part of this exhibition, while this was happening, and European Union was curiously identifying the Roma as the biggest minority in Europe, whatever that means, Sarkozy was actually deporting European Union citizens who were Roma. So this whole notion of multicultural project, so I'm actually, I have my reservations about how it was deployed. The way in which it was happening, it has happened in the context of Istanbul, was that when this project, the European Capital of Culture project was accepted, one of the things that has happened is the gentrification process in such a way that basically the Roma themselves were this, seen as these people who were the, multicultural part of the heritage of the city, but then they just removed the people and just kept the buildings instead. But in the European Union, like in the Istanbul project, European Capital of Culture, such a long name, project, they were also using their music and things like that. So it's just the music, the buildings are okay, but not the actual people themselves.
They put on their homes too.
Right. And so it's just, and the ways in which the project was actually reassigned was in such a way that it was hard for them to pay for the new housings there. So I think that, and there were a lot of collaborations that were done at that time with also, I believe, with the LGBTQ groups in Istanbul at that time to protest this.
I'm just going to start with saying that actually I think 2 days ago, the Tarlabaşı case, which also involves actually Roma and Kurds and Greeks and, you name it, was also elected as the best urban transformation gentrification project of Europe. And I guess that actually shows that, if Europe didn't get this, what's going on after all this, they're not really going to get it. And I'm not sure if they care what is going on. And I guess it's also, shows us, it's really local initiative. It's very important to be locally based and explain your causes. There's no point going and explaining these people what's really going on. As far as the Roma question is concerned, I guess Roma also had, somewhat a representation at Gezi. Not the most visible one, but you would see that, flower sellers on the street, and they were kind of supporting the movement by giving roses to the protesters and those kind of things. But I guess Roma is also one of those minority, quote-unquote, minority groups that's been minority almost in every context, right? They are the bottom of the bottom. And what happened with the current government, I guess, that increasingly became also a moral question and a question of policy. So when these people were removed, Suluk Kule and some other neighborhoods, it was presented as if the police was doing some sort of security operation to get rid of insecure and gang members, and in a way again gathering support from Istanbulites for their movement. And unfortunately, I guess that was a selling point to an extent. And I hope this will be an opportunity. I mean, Gezi was an opportunity to see for people. I mean, with their own experiences, you should not really believe what you see on the TV. And Roma definitely Sulukule, Tarlabaşı, and now Armutlu, Gülsuyu, these are all examples of gentrification. And unfortunately, all of those cases correspond to some sort of ethno-religious class issue in Turkey. And we really need to face this, we really need to talk about this. And I know somebody put it up there, but we can't really, conclude this conversation without mentioning that there is actually a police invasion going on at Ottu as we speak. So I guess it's still going on.
Thank you, Zeynep. And we come to the end of our program. Thank you very much for coming tonight, and we look forward to